We are so happy to have Melissa Rogers tonight to talk about her new book. It's called Faith in American Public Life. It just came off the presses a few months ago, so very, very new. And one of the reasons we're so lucky to have her, I'm sure those of you who know her already know this, but she's an expert on the role and influence of religion in our public life, hence the title of the book. And especially the intersection of religion, law, and public policy and politics, which, of course, as we see increasingly every day, intersect and overlap in ways that maybe none of us at one time could have imagined, and certainly the founders may not have imagined or had imagined and tried to guard against. In any case, Melissa's trained as a lawyer. She has a special expertise in the First Amendment's religion clauses. She was named executive director of the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships under President Obama. She's now a visiting professor at Wake Forest School of Divinity, a non-resident scholar at Brookings. She's won way too many awards for me to be able to list. And for so many contributions in this field. But I think most of all, it's fair to say that you are, titles aside, just a sheer, dedicated, devoted, passionate champion of religious tolerance and religious pluralism. And of course, those are sacred pillars of our democracy. And we know that those pillars and those values that underlie them are gravely under assault, not only in hateful rhetoric that we hear emanating not just on social media, but out of the mouths of some of our very own political leaders, and in acts of terrible intimidation and violence against faith communities around our country. And again, sadly, these events seem to have escalated in the past few years. I hope you will be able to enlighten us on the roots of this hatred and xenophobia, what some have referred to as a kind of white ethno-nationalism that has misappropriated at times Christian values in the name of political extremism as our country grows more diverse. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you talk about that. And so we're just delighted to have you here, and your book obviously could not be more timely. It just seems to get more relevant a subject every day. In conversation with Melissa tonight, we are very, very lucky to have my former colleague and friend, Mike McCurry, who himself is also a passionate defender of religious tolerance and religious pluralism. I'm sure you all know that Mike is a veteran of democratic politics. He worked on the Hill. He's worked on high-level...
There's like veteran. 40 years.
Okay, sorry. 4 veterans. He's worked on the Hill. He's worked at high levels of presidential campaigns. And then he got recruited to be the chief spokesman for the State Department in the Clinton administration, and then got lured over to the White House to be White House press secretary. And I'm not just saying this because I like him and respect him, but I think it's a widely shared view that Mike McCurry was one of the truly greatest, best, most able, adept White House press secretaries ever. And that is not an easy job.
Thank you very much. It's a job that apparently no longer exists.
Yeah, that's true too. See, you did it so well, they just didn't want to have to follow in his huge footsteps. Anyway, he's now a partner at Public Strategies Washington, where he does strategic consulting on communications and management for corporate and non-corporate clients. But of course, more relevant to the conversation tonight is that this guy apparently thought that having a degree from Princeton and then a master's from Georgetown was not enough. So he had to go back to school later in life, and he did go back to school, and he got his master's at Wesley Theological Seminary in 2013. And he is now, I have to get this title right, he holds the title of Distinguished Professor of Public Theology at Wesley and teaches courses about religion and politics. So this subject obviously is something he has thought about very deeply as well. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I know all of you are. Thank you both so much for coming. We're honored to have you, and please join me in welcoming Melissa Rogers and Mike McCurry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That title of distinguished professor means that you're not in the tenure track, so you're not in competition with others. I want to start Melissa, with the book and the cover of the book. Tell us a little bit about the cover and how you chose the photograph here, and hopefully all of you can see a little bit of this.
Yeah. Okay, I will do that. First, let me say just thank you, Alyssa Muscatine, and to the whole staff here at Politics and Prose. You have an amazing bookstore here. It's the first time I've been to this location. And I was just getting the story from Alyssa before we started the event about how she and her husband took this over 2011, I believe, was when you started, and how everybody, in Washington views Politics and Prose as this treasure. And she was saying, we didn't want to mess up this treasure, and I think we can all agree they not only have done no harm, they have brought it to new heights and been such good stewards of the legacy of Politics and Prose and made room for us to do this tonight. So thank you so much. And it's so great to be here with Mike McCurry as well. One other quick mention, my editor, the guy who pulled the book out of my hands and coached me every step of the way, is here, Carrie Newman, who formerly of Baylor University Press, and I'm just very glad that he's here. This book is as much as it is mine, so I want to thank him. And we suffered to get this photo on this book. There's a long story behind this, getting this picture on the book, so I'll segue into your question, Mike. This picture is one of a protest that happened outside of an agency of the Department of Homeland Security, and it was a protest by women clergy and women of faith of the family separation policy, the policy of separating children from their parents or other guardians at the border. And you all, I think, will remember that policy and how deeply it affected our thinking and our hearts and minds. And so I was at this particular protest, and we had great leadership at the protest. You can see in the photo we have all kinds of Muslim, Jewish, Christian, all denominations of Christian women at the ready here with their signs and their stoles and all of those things. And the Reverend Leslie Copeland-Toon, who is currently with the National Council of Churches, is holding the bullhorn and giving a very passionate address. And she was so eloquent that day. And when I was looking for a picture of this sort, and when I found it, I said, okay, this is the one. Because it not only had people of faith raising a prophetic critique of our government, which I think is the apex of an authentic expression of religion in public life. They were actually doing so on government property, right in front of the agency that they wanted to speak to. And so you can see in the photo, if you look closely, the little emblem of the Department of Homeland Security right above the window here. And when we first got the photo, Carrie and I were working on it, and his staff had the black drawn down over that emblem. And I said, no, you got to take it back up, because that's important. People have to see that this is an expression of the prophetic critique by faith communities. I think religious engagement at its best in our own country and around the world when we are speaking to government and raising a prophetic critique of government. So that's a little bit about the story. I happened to be there that day, which made it great that I could remember all these details. And so, and also let me single out the Afro newsletter and newspaper that still operates in Baltimore. They were the ones who granted us permission to use this photo. It was theirs, and they were very kind about granting us permission very quickly to put it on our book. So I'm thankful to all who are displayed in the photo, and to the Afro magazine, and to Carrie and the Baylor University Press for getting this photo on the cover.
That's a promo for the book, which you all need to read and to enjoy, and which presumably you will sign for people.
I will do so, yes.
Going to buy it.
Yeah, I forgot to say, she will sign books at the end, and they're filled at the counter. We'll have an opportunity also to ask questions to Mike, and Melissa will talk for 20 minutes, half hour or so, and then we'll open it up. Oh, and I should also, was anybody sometimes we have people in the crowd who were at the protest. Raise your hand if that, okay, just wanted to make sure. Go ahead.
All right, well, let's start with kind of the obvious question, which is when people talk about religion and politics is, oh, we separate church and state.
Right.
And we have a very strong tradition of that here. Your book really breaks that down a little bit and talks about the relevance of religion to politics and how faith really informs a lot of what happens in public advocacy and the work the government does. So talk a little bit about that, but, beginning with the idea that there's a separation of church and state, but what is the relevance of religion to politics?
Right, right. So one of the things we quickly encounter, and Mike's pulling on, is just there's so much confusion about this area and a lot of sort of shorthand that's used that isn't unpacked, and then we're left sometimes not only confused, but actually disagreeing with each other unnecessarily in this area, which is great when you can find an unnecessary disagreement in this area, because there are plenty of necessary ones. Yes, because we have this old phrase of separation of church and state, and I certainly count myself as a big proponent of separation of church and state from dating back to Thomas Jefferson and then before him Roger Williams. We sort of use that sometimes as a shorthand to talk about what the First Amendment to our Constitution says. The First Amendment, as you all know, says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So we have a no establishment clause and a free exercise clause. And, we can get into more detail about those later, but I would say generally speaking and boiled down very much, the Establishment Clause says the government cannot promote religion itself. It can be involved with religion in some ways, but it can't be the proponent or the evangelist of religion. It has to protect, however, every religious individual and institution's right to express their faith, and indeed people of no faith or just, non-religious beliefs are also protected by government. So how that, and the free exercise clause plays a role there too in ensuring that people can practice their faith, not just behind the closed doors of houses of worship and homes, but actually in public spaces. So when you have something like this protest, you see that it is religious people speaking on government property, and that is something that is protected speech. What we do not protect is when government is trying to push a religious point of view as government, because the government has to be neutral and protect everybody's religious point of view and non-religious points of view too. Now there are wrinkles here, right? Because we can immediately think of prayers before legislative sessions. So, there's some wrinkles here that we talk about. Also, presidents can talk about their faith, their personal faith, because the Supreme Court has said we recognize that presidents, when they speak on behalf of make a speech to the nation or the world, they're not just speaking about, on behalf of government, they're also talking about where they grew up and what they believe and their family. So having their own faith, if they do have a faith expressed that way, is of course allowed. And then candidates can express their faith, and we have a whole lot of that going on right now. That is not constitutionally prohibited. What we do need to do, I think at the candidate level and at the presidential level, is always make sure that when our leaders are speaking about their personal faith or just about religion in general, that they make it clear that there are no second-class religions under the Constitution of the United States. And so if they are talking about their personal faith, that's all well and good, but never in a way that would make someone who is a different faith or of no faith feel like they are any less of a citizen than the speaker. So that is really key. And then, of course, we have religious groups because of their free speech and free exercise rights, playing a very vigorous role in campaigns, organizing, turning out the vote, getting out the vote, I was just this week tweeting about Reverend Dr. William Barber, who some of you know, who has started inviting all presidential candidates to come to his church in North Carolina to worship. So he says, y'all come, come to my church. You're all welcome to come. We're not going to have you speaking from the pulpit in our church, and that's another kind of wrinkle we can talk about, that it isn't a constitutional prohibition, but rather one keyed to tax-exempt status of houses of worship and other nonprofits. But he says that it's not just for that reason he's not going to have people speaking from the pulpit, but also because he wants to have control over the integrity of the worship experience. And he wants to be directing that with his church members. But he also says to the candidates that may visit, please join us for a dialogue after the service. And then he says, he sets the agenda and says, I would like you to come, and we're going to talk about poverty and racial justice and all these other issues. And I was tweeting about it because I thought it was a really constructive model to say, everybody can come and worship, and then we want you to sit down and actually dialogue with us about the things that matter to us as people of faith and as Americans. And we're going to have an exchange with you. You are not just going to be talking at us. We're going to be asking you questions and engaging you and saying, well, you said X, but we don't see anything in your record that says that you actually care about X, So anyway, that just gets us started in this religion and politics sphere.
Well, going back to Jefferson, that whole wall of separation, that whole idea was actually a letter, I think, that Jefferson sent to a bunch of Baptists.
Danbury Baptist
in Danbury,
Association.
Connecticut. So
Yeah.
it was actually protecting their right, because they were fearful that there would be
exactly.
some established religion in this new republic that we were forming.
Right.
And he was assuring them that there would be diversity, there would be, kind of an ecumenical view of how you would be allowed to practice religion in this new republic. So it goes back to our very founders. But
Absolutely.
you just covered a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about. Assess the way in which we are talking about faith and faith beliefs in the current context of this political contest that's underway now.
Yeah.
It is. I will be careful here and not sort of say that our current president doesn't seem to much revolve around these issues, but some of the candidates who are going to attempt to oppose him, they do, and they raise their faith. And is that something that we need to see more of in our political dialogue, or is it something that's kind of like confuses people and makes us more divided, more polarized than we already clearly are?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, and I guess I'd start by saying, my belief is that if a candidate is him or herself religious, and on the campaign trail they're explaining so much about who they are, then I want them to feel free to share their faith beliefs and practices if they want to, not that they should be required to do so, because some people don't want to do so, even though they are strong people of faith. But again, always, as I said, in the spirit of the Constitution, so it is not communicating to people that they are outsiders because they don't share that faith. I also think it's helpful, when people on all points of the spectrum, to some extent, political spectrum, are talking about their personal faith, because if only people on one side from one political party are talking about their faith or faith in general, then people can get the wrong impression that somehow God is a Democrat or God is a Republican, and God, of course, is neither. So, to the extent that there's been a long history on the more Republican side of talking about faith, and and that's not blanketly true, but it's more true than not, then I think it's been helpful for Democrats to be able to say, I too am a person of faith, and I want to make that clear, because otherwise we could get a skewed picture of what, how people practice their faith in the United States of America. And I think it's been very helpful, actually, to have people on all points of the spectrum say, I come from a faith perspective, and these issues are the most important to me. Maybe it's refugee resettlement, refugee admissions and resettlement, or maybe it's a position against torture. And others will say, well, it's abortion that's pro-life for me. So I think that's a helpful dialogue to be able to show how Americans come at it differently. At the same time, I'd always say we always have to be careful, and I say this as a Christian myself, that we don't want to use our religion for political gain, and that's a hard thing. That's a hard line to walk. Some things are more important than politics. And that would be true of a person's faith. So how do we make sure that we're living out the biblical admonitions of not practicing our faith solely for people to see it, and yet also, being forthcoming about what motivates us to get involved in public life?
But there is a political dimension to this. I saw, I think on the bookshelves here, you can get the book that Robert Putnam and David Campbell wrote, American Grace, which really talks about and spells out some of the differences between the way in which Democrats and Republicans tend to look at faith when it comes to politics. Right. And their observation is that the Democrats tend to be more blue and more secular, and Republicans tend to be more red and more religious. And religion and religious affiliations, particularly if you look at, for the Republican Party in Iowa, when they go to campaign there, they are very overt in their appeal to, evangelicals and others. And Democrats seem to be a little bit off kilter on that. They seem to be more secular. So you've got some observations on that in the book, but why do Democrats seem to be kind of shy away from overt expressions of faith and religiosity when they are doing politics, which is, we're in the middle of that now.
Right. I mean, I think some of them have maybe there are a variety of explanations. I think some of them have maybe overread the prohibition on, or the admonition of church-state separation, so that they don't want to cross lines when they actually, I think there's more freedom there than they have recognized. Some of them are worried about politicizing their faith. They don't want to do that. But I think that at least in this cycle on the presidential level, we have a lot of Democrats talking about religion. We have, I think it was just this week, Elizabeth Warren was raising the idea of Jubilee and debt forgiveness on the trail. I was like, okay, yeah, you don't hear that every day on the trail. We hear, we've heard Pete Buttigieg talk about, his own faith at numerous times. Cory Booker talking about his faith repeatedly. And a lot of the candidates I meant to say earlier have raised it, particularly with regard to health care for people, and how they believe that is something that is a moral consideration, that we have to have health care for every individual. So I think we're seeing, certainly compared to the last presidential cycle, I think we're seeing more discussion of religion. Would you agree? You watch this closely. You said it on a trip next week. You may want to mention, but
I definitely agree with that. I'm taking a group of my Wesley Theological Seminary students now. I now, having been White House press secretary, I now teach at a Methodist seminary, which is called the Doctrine of Atonement. But we're going to go out to Iowa and explore what candidates are doing, and there are a bunch of events happening in Iowa about faith and politics and the common good, and how do you define that, and what does that all look like. But I want you to also reflect a little bit, what you do in the book, about your experience at the White House. Now, I think it's accurate that George Bush was the one who
Exactly.
first established the Office of Faith Outreach at the White House. Obviously, then President Obama continued it. You worked after Joshua Dubois
Yes.
ran that office. But tell us a little bit about the history of that. What did you do, and what kind of impact did you have at the White House running that office?
Yeah, and I have some colleagues here who were formerly in our staff working on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships, Addie Martin and Brendan Byers, and if I'm missing anybody, raise your hand. Oh, yes, good. Marcus Coleman, too. So it's great to have them here, and I'm sure they'll have lots to contribute to the discussion, too. Yes, President Bush established this office. At the time, it was called the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. But my friend John Ditullio, I think you probably know John too, a professor at University of Pennsylvania, as the first director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in the White House. And John is a scholar and a practitioner, and most importantly, a person with a huge heart. And did a lot of great work to serve people in need. There were some, church state controversies, and we can get into some of those, if you wish. I'll bypass them for now. But then when President Obama decided to keep the office, some people were a little surprised, but they really shouldn't have been if they'd known his record, because he worked as a community organizer in the south side of Chicago, working as one of his first jobs, working with churches and working out of a Catholic church, out of a fund that was supported by the Catholic Church to help organize people on the south side of Chicago for economic empowerment. And so he understood, and he's a committed Christian himself, so he understood and understands the importance of religious engagement with government, the important role that people of faith play in doing all manner of things. But one of the things is, or two of the things are, letting the government know about people that are hurting. People that are hurting may not be able to raise their voices in a way that government can hear them, but people in the faith and community sphere, they specialize in that, and they bring those concerns to the table and help to get government's attention to then help people in need. And of course, that's the idea of the office. And President Obama was and Dennis McDonough, his chief of staff, who I served under during the second term, was very adamant that when we had a big problem, we were going to have faith and humanitarian organizations at the table because it was absolutely essential to solving the problem. The first term, President appointed Joshua Dubois, my friend and colleague, a terrific guy who many of you know, to run the office. He was a very young man at the time, still is pretty young, but he did a terrific job leading.
And kind of a spiritual counselor.
Yes, a very spiritual person himself, and wrote a book, the president's devotional. Later, after he left the White House. So, he ran the office during the first term, and I had the privilege and honor of working with Joshua, who's on many things. And then, to my surprise, I ended up running the office during the second term. And so I got to inherit all the good work Joshua had done and work with my colleagues here to try to further it. And we can tell any number of stories, but one I'll just mention, I'll never forget the story about the Ebola virus and how right away the president called us together and said, we must have faith and humanitarian groups at the table working on the Ebola virus. And we had groups, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, everyone at the table the next morning, and people who disagreed mightily with one another on politics, and a number of whom didn't vote for President Obama, at that table working together, immediately forming a team to try to tackle this, not only in West Africa, but also in the United States. So, those stories don't get told very often, but they're told in my book, and they really do happen, and thank God for it, because I think we really are able to accomplish so much together when we take that approach.
You mentioned John Ditullio,
Yeah.
who was George Bush's director of the office that really began
Right.
what you then inherited later. And he told me once that every time he would get to go into the West Wing and get to see the president from time to time. Every time he went in, George Bush would say, "Hey, I'm glad you're here. What are you working on?" And he would get excited about stuff. But John felt like, there were other political people at the West Wing, there's all this stuff goes on, politics, that he wasn't really taking that seriously from time to time. Did you have to fight to get attention in the Oval Office?
Sometimes you have to persuade people that you need to be at the table. Yes, sometimes you need to persuade people. Never, the president always understood it, just as George W. Bush did. President Obama always understood why and then before me, Joshua Dubois and our colleagues, why we needed to be at the table and why faith and humanitarian groups needed to be at the table. But sometimes other people needed to be convinced.
Yeah, but unpack that a little bit for us. I mean, is it because the political Sharpies in the West Wing just don't care that much about religion, or they don't see what the connections are between the faith community and what they're trying to pursue, or what the political objectives are? Or, why is there this reluctance to kind of embrace the faith community and see it that is a relevant part of our political culture and what we need to get done in this country? Why is that?
Well, I think sometimes people, and certainly this is not true of most, but some might just not be as familiar with religious activism in the public square, even if they are persons of faith themselves. That's not how they haven't done that and seen that happen. And so it doesn't naturally come to their mind that this is Ebola virus. We got to have the faith and humanitarian groups there. They think about, they might think of the secular humanitarian groups, but then they might leave off the faith groups. And another reason is sometimes I think some of the advisors might think, oh, it's just going to be kind of complicated if we bring the faith groups in. You mean we're going to have the Christian and the Jewish and the Muslim and the Hindu and the Baha'i and the Sikhs all sitting together, and will they play nice? Will they agree? Will they, and what about, that's not even to mention the political differences. I mean, we all know, they're Christians who lean right and Christians who lean left. And
tell me about it. I'm in the Methodist Church.
Oh, how timely. Oh, how timely our discussion is. So, I think it was a kind of do no harm impulse, like, whoa, my gosh, are we going to have all these people sitting in the room? And can we trust those people on the right who have some criticisms of President Obama? And that's when, we would try to do our work with Joshua and before me, and then I followed to try to say, there are a lot of good people who may not have voted for President Obama, but want to work with him where there are shared concerns, and they care about people, and they understand that is what we're working on. We're working on solving people's problems and helping people in need, and that is the bullseye, and they want to be there. And you had to put your own reputation. I'm sure you had some similar instances of a different nature, but you had to say to them, I promise this will be okay. And then you went back to your office and, made sure everything would be okay. But, and also say to them, I want you to know that the president, if the president hears that these people were not included, he will be disappointed. He will be feeling like we did not do our utmost. So sometimes it was just a matter of bringing people along on those issues. It's not their world. I understand it's hard. We all know something about this world. It's a complicated world, and so I don't begrudge people from not understanding it. I am very thankful, and I do think that people who might not, and I understand why people might not think that an office like this, they might be nervous about an office like this in the White House, and it can be called many different things or organized many different ways, but I do think that there have to be people who have religious literacy in the federal government, and working towards secular ends, not promoting religion, but saying, how do we solve problems for people in need, whether it's gun violence or healthcare, or filling out FAFSA forms for high school students, or working on summer food meal service programs, which John and Ditullio and I did together when I was in the White House. We got to have religious groups at the table to do that work.
All right, not to be political or provocative, but what's happening in this current White House and the current administration around these issues? I know there are people, I mean, we go and we take student groups in to meet with various people who are working in these areas, but how do you assess how the people are working on these things in the current White House?
Yeah, okay. So, and then let me add one thing before that. There are people, they're not only the religious and the non-religious or the secular groups, they're also the intentionally not religious people, the Secular Coalition for America, for instance, and they want to help too. So that's also very important to include them. On the current administration, I don't have a lot of information, but I'll share whatever, what I know, which is that the office that I held and Joshua before me, and of course in the Bush years, that position was not filled. I don't think the position, as far as I can tell, the position that existed that we held isn't the position that Paula White currently holds. She holds.
I could say the same thing about the Office of White House Press Secretary.
Our office, at least during the Obama years, we were housed within the Domestic Policy Council. We also worked with the National Security Council, but we were housed within the Domestic Policy Council and worked on partnerships with faith and community groups, as well as domestic and foreign policy when it touched on religion issues. The Paula White, who is a televangelist and minister who, as I understand it, holds a part-time position in the White House working for the Office of Public Liaison, I believe they call it. And she, I don't know if she's doing the partnership work. It sounds like she's doing outreach to some religious communities. So that's what I know. I don't know much more than that.
Well, I think the president famously said this past weekend that God is on our side, which is a provocative
problem. Yes.
comment. I think it wasn't Abraham Lincoln that once said, the question is not whether God is on our side, but whether we are on God's side.
Exactly, yeah.
Which was a good retort.
Exactly.
But they, it's a delicate question here about how do you really bring faith and spirituality into the discussions that are contemporary and deal with a lot of these controversial issues. I think a lot of people would say keep religion out of all this. Keep Christianity or faith belief out of these political discussions because that complicates things. You make a very provocative argument for exactly the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And, talk a little bit about that. I mean, how do you bring religious faith belief into some of the controversies that we deal with in a way that is going to help move things forward to a common good?
Right. Well, I think, and one point to stress is that it's not really a choice for government whether they engage with religious groups and leaders at all. It's a constitutional mandate that government has to, if it meets with other people, and it should and does, it needs to meet with all the citizenry, whether they're religious or not religious. It has a duty, and people who are people of faith have a right to express their concerns in the public sphere, to meet with government officials on the same basis as non-religious groups and individuals. So that's, I think it's not even a matter for debate, it's something that we have to accept, and that goes for non-religious people too, of course. avowedly non-religious people like atheists and agnostics and all that. So that's a given as a constitutional requirement that we respect those free speech and free exercise rights. After having said that, there's no question that this is really complicated, and I think, we need to really think about it carefully, so that I think every White House, every administration needs some people who understand these issues from a legal and policy perspective, from a perspective of pluralism, and are going to be empowered to ride herd on those issues throughout the federal government. Because sometimes I would find people in an agency who thought that they couldn't or shouldn't be meeting with religious people. And I had to, it wasn't that they were ill-intentioned, it's thought they had wooden ideas about the separation of church and state. So you have to work on that. So, the bottom line is, I think it just requires that we have people within government who, of course not everyone, just have some people within the White House and within the federal government who outsiders can find and insiders can find, and who are empowered to work on these issues and are informed about our tradition of religious liberty and church-state separation, and are committed to the principles of church and state separation and religious liberty in the United States. Easier said than done, but I think that's what we need.
I want to open it up to questions from all of you, but my last question is, or my last comment would be, you write both as a lawyer, and I think that one of the interesting things about the book is how much you unpack a lot of the constitutional history and theory around this. But when you were writing the book, what frame of mind was most important to you? Was it a person of faith, a constitutional scholar, a lawyer of these matters with some repute? What was your basic frame?
Oh, now here I'm gonna frustrate you the same way I did my editor and publisher Carrie Newman when I said all three. I kept on saying, "Give me one answer," and I was like, "Can I give you three?" But certainly, I think I try to start with the law and try to express what I understand about the law. And by the way, I have my colleagues from the Baptist Joint Committee here, where I did Amanda Tyler and Sherilyn Crow, where I did my first work on church-state issues. I'm so proud of the work they do these days to carry on the proud Baptist tradition of church-state separation and religious liberty. But I tried to bring the training that I had learned from our predecessors, James Dunn and Brent Walker, and a lot of other wonderful people, another board member here from the Baptist Joint Committee as well. I tried to bring my training as a lawyer and as a Baptist to unpacking this area, which can be quite bewildering, So I started with that, but then I also, I threaded in some of my own experiences as a practitioner in government, because I learned things I never would have learned, had I not had that wonderful honor of working in government. And also, although not primarily, but express some things, from a personal faith perspective. I included in there, for example, of course we want people of faith to be engaged in politics and policy, but we want them never at the expense of the integrity of the religious voice, because if you give that up, then you ain't got nothing to to really tell people of value. So from the faith tradition. So anyway, I guess that's a bit of a Weasley answer, but there you have it.
Well, join our conversation, and who's got questions? Got a couple of hands up over here. Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much for your comments and discussion. I'm curious. I really haven't followed this as closely as I probably should have, but I was very concerned.
I know you've been following it pretty closely, so that's saying something.
I've been very concerned about when the Muslim ban was announced, And I know the first two iterations of the proposed ban didn't follow through, but there was a third.
Yeah.
And so what kind of status would there be in relationship to that?
Yeah. Well, as you are following this pretty closely because you know the different iterations. But the Muslim ban, as you recall, then candidate Trump called for a total and complete shutdown on Muslims entering the United States during the campaign, and then when he became president, implemented a travel ban that was based on the first iteration Muslim majority countries, and then some other countries were added in as it went along. And so the question was whether that was constitutional, whether the first iteration, the second iteration, and the third iteration were constitutional. And of course, they were challenged at every bend and turn. And I believe Baptist Joint Committee weighed in on this, filed briefs, I believe, in all of the iterations. And there were decisions striking down the first and second iteration. I can't do it all justice. There were decisions of different kinds for different reasons. But then ultimately the third iteration, which had been, revised to take out some of the things that had been pointed out by the courts in the earlier litigation, that third case made its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court narrowly upheld the ban, saying that whatever was going on in the motivation for the ban and some of its terms and impact, that the majority of the court felt that there was they needed to defer to the executive branch's national security judgment in this case. Now there was very, very stiff dissent filed there were several dissents, but the principal dissent was by Justice Sotomayor, 4 justices saying that this should have been struck down, and as a violation of the Establishment Clause, and that was the argument that was before the court about the First Amendment's Establishment Clause and whether this ban emanated and was based on an animus toward religion, which would be unconstitutional if it had been so. So there was that litigation, and there's still, in the wake of that litigation, there have been efforts at the litigation level to deal with various aspects of it. Other aspects of it, of course, the Supreme Court has spoken, and there has been efforts through legislation to try to deal with the situation so that it would prohibit future kinds of travel bans, Muslim bans from happening. So it's a complicated issue. And I should mention also that it was put in particularly sharp relief by a decision of the court that came around this time with the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, where the baker, and I can't do this case justice, where the baker refused to turned away a same-sex couple, when they came to ask that they make cake for their wedding, and the baker immediately turned them away. There was some indication in the record that some of the government officials in the lower court cases dealing with the Masterpiece Cake Shop case had been less than neutral toward the baker in their commentary on the case. And so the court ruled for the baker on that basis. And what was disconcerting, I will say, is to see that the court took that kind of expression of bias against the baker's faith in that case very seriously, and seemed to treat what I would say was much stronger evidence of bias against a particular faith in the travel ban case, and treat that as not disqualifying of that policy. So those two cases coming down close in time together raise the stakes on asking, do we have religious liberty for everyone, or do we just have it for some? Because if we only have it for some, then we really don't have religious liberty at all. It has to be for everyone. And it deals with this kind of cynicism that I think we've seen grow in recent years about whether, when we are talking about the virtues of religious liberty, are we really willing to extend it to everyone? And there can be problems coming from the right and the left on this. You know, there can be blind spots on the Democrat side, blind spots on the Republican side. It has to be taking religious liberty seriously across the spectrum. Now, that doesn't mean that all religious liberty claims should win. You know, I don't think they should. And I can give you cases, specific cases, but we should subject them all to the same standards, and we should take them seriously and not dismiss them because they're not people that share our faith.
All right, I want to get other questions in, but I can't resist asking an obvious one here. What's your assessment of our current Supreme Court and its ability to wrestle with some of these exact questions that you just defined, religious liberty, because they have cases that are going to come to them in next term, if not this term.
This term, yeah, there's several cases this term. And, you know, I think I'm waiting and I'm watching. I was very disappointed by the ruling in the Hawaii versus Trump case, which is the travel ban Muslim case. I thought it came out the wrong way. And I was very disappointed personally in Justice Kennedy's vote, because Justice Kennedy had been, in years prior, had been very careful in a previous case involving a small religious minority who had been given the runaround by a state or local governmental body, the Church of Lukumi Babaluae, if I may say so. I just had to get that in. I love that name. It's such a great name. But anyway, Justice Kennedy, I thought, had shown real insight and courage and commitment in taking a case that the lower courts had not given adequate attention to and saying to this Florida government officials, you have not given these people equal treatment on religious liberty issues. You have tried to stop them from practicing their faith in a way that violates the free exercise clause of the Constitution, and we are holding you accountable. That was a great day. I was very proud to be an American on that day, and I'm very proud many, many times when the Supreme Court rules, but and many times otherwise, of course, always. But you know, when this decision came down in Trump versus Hawaii, that was a bad ruling, I thought, and it was a disappointing ruling. So I do think that we have to look at it case by case, and I do very much appreciate Chief Justice Roberts' a commitment he was saying recently and has said in statements that we don't have Democrat judges and Republican judges. We just have judges trying their best to rule on the law. I very much appreciate those statements. I see in what he has done sometimes in terms of accepting cases and trying to build majorities that aren't just all the Republican nominated judges versus all the democratically nominated judges. I appreciate what he's doing in that regard. I hope he'll continue to try to be a good steward of the institutional integrity of the court, but we'll have to wait and see.
Others? Yeah, several hands up.
Hello, my name is Cobra. I'm working at Rumi Forum.
Yeah.
You have already given some cues to my question, but I would like to hear your opinion about where religion is in America standing right now when we have the last decade in mind. Because the role we dress in religion is constantly changing. So what would be your overall opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you so much for coming. The Rumi Forum, if you all do not know, a terrific organization that we worked closely with when I was in the administration. We appreciate your work and your question. So that's a great question. I think one of the things that I'm really concerned about right now is that there's too much rhetoric, including from some government officials, trying to divide us along religious lines. I think government officials ought to always be trying to bring us together across our religious differences, including those people who aren't religious. And, I think we can all point to things that we think were ill-advised, but we've had a pretty strong bipartisan tradition through the years of, especially with, our presidents through the years, trying to bring people together across religious lines. And I think we have seen too many times where there's fear-mongering on the basis of religion and race and ethnicity that we need to just speak out against and have absolutely no tolerance for. So that's one thing that I think is disturbing. We also have a very terrible situation where too many people in our country are now fearful. They can't practice their religion without fear. We have this shooting in Texas, a Texas church just recently, and this horrible daily hatred and violence against Jewish people in the New York, New Jersey area. And then we've had African American churches targeted, and mosques and synagogues and temples. And the hate crime statistics only tell us a little bit of that picture because they only tell us what people report. And a lot of jurisdictions don't report any hate crimes at all. I'm looking at my friend Dr. Singh here, who follows this closely and has done such great work on bringing people together across religious differences. Thank you, Dr. Singh. So, I think we see this happening and it just cuts us to the quick. And it's so regrettable. The thing that I cling to is, the things that I have seen my colleagues at the Rumi Forum, Dr. Singh, the Baptist Joint Committee, so many in this room, when there is a threat to any religion, these are the people you see coming together and say, that is a threat against my religion. We are standing with you. You will see that every time happening. And I think that movement is growing stronger. And I'm very, very proud of that and just cherish the kind of friendships and solidarity that we experience in the religious liberty community on that score.
And we do have time for one more question.
There's a gentleman. Sorry.
Yes, and Melissa will answer any other questions afterwards as she's signing up here at the table, and the books are available at the registers.
Hi, Michael Barr. I was a student of Mike's at Wesley.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
An A student, by the way.
Woohoo!
Yeah. I had a question. With the recent discussion about the Christianity Today op-ed.
Yes.
I heard a discussion with Richard Land and Mark Galley.
I listened to that today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so I was very curious, your thought. Richard Land asserted that, and this is an assertion of evangelical supporters for Trump, that he has done more for religious liberty than any president in modern memory.
Yeah.
And I'm
identify who Richard Land is.
Or I can. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So, did you want?
Yeah, and so it sounds like, do you feel his perspective is skewed toward evangelical, like what Trump has done for evangelicals, or
Yes.
do you just not see the same kind of productivity on behalf of religious liberty?
Yeah, I actually wrote an op-ed about this just in the last few days, so I'll be happy to share it with you.
And I'll take Michael's question as make it a little broader. Like,
Okay.
People are confounded. Why do mostly white Christian evangelicals seem to be so supportive of Donald Trump, who seems to be antithetical to some of the things that they would otherwise profess to be part of their belief? That's kind of a general...
Right.
Gives you a little running room there to talk.
Right. So Richard Land was formerly head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. The Baptist Joint Committee that I mentioned is not affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, different strands of Baptist life. I know and have worked with Dr. Land. And I did listen to that program today. I think that what you heard Mark Galley saying, the editor who wrote the CT editorial, saying about, and I'll just limit my comments to the religious liberty part of the equation for now. Mark Galley started out by saying, now, I don't think we can say that President Trump has in the United States promoted religion. I don't think we necessarily can say that he's promoted religious liberty for everyone. He certainly has been attentive to the domestic religious liberty concerns of Christians. I'm not quoting him, so please don't go listen to it if you want to hear his exact quote. But it was something of that nature. So I think he was trying to parse that in a way that I thought was accurate in some important respects. What President Trump has done, I think, has appointed judges and resolved some domestic policy disputes about the conflict of religious liberty claims and claims for LGBTQ equality or reproductive rights, balanced those mostly in favor of the religious liberty claim. And that has been something that some groups of Christians have asked for, like Dr. Land. The BJC would take different position on some of those cases, but I'll let them speak for themselves. Not all, but some. And so the conservative Christian community would say that, well, he's given us what we wanted on these issues, and we're fearful of what Democrats would do on these issues, that they would not be sensitive to our religious liberty concerns. And that's the claim that they make. Now, when they make it in that way, I think that is, I can hear that claim and not, and I can argue with the merits of the various resolution of the cases, but I don't immediately take offense. What I take offense at is when, and what I think is wrong, is when Christians who are conservatives or other religious conservatives saying that Donald Trump has been a champion for religious freedom. I don't think you can say that of a person who called for a total and complete shutdown of an entire religious community entering the country simply because of their faith. You cannot say that. And you cannot say that about somebody who's appointed people who have said that Muslims shouldn't serve in public office. You can't say that about somebody who's tweeted anti-Muslim propaganda. You can't say that about him. And I think that they should not offer uncritical praise for his religious liberty record. So that's been my ask, to say don't hold him up as a champion of religious liberty, and do not give him uncritical praise. To the extent that you want to praise certain policy decisions he's made or certain judicial appointments, please feel free. This is America. Stand up and make your case, and I may agree with you or I may disagree with you, but that's the point I was trying to drive home in this editorial, and saying to everybody, especially when we have these attacks on people not being able to walk down the street with a yarmulke on or a turban or a headscarf, we cannot afford to have anybody, much less the President of the United States, engaging in fear-mongering on factors of religion and other factors.
I think the only proper response to that is amen. I want to say it is so wonderful to be here. You all need to get a copy of the book and buy a book, but isn't it wonderful to be in a place where books are sold and you don't have to go on Amazon to get them?
Amen to that
too. We need to fight and support bookstores.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone, and it's such a joy to be here with you tonight, and I feel every time I get to be with people like you, it is a real shot in the arm, and I will take all the shots in the arm I can get these days. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you.